How's your hammer, everybody? I'm PTDevil, and welcome to another episode of The Deck Doctors. In this series, we'll be looking at some of the most unplayable archetypes in the whole game, figuring out why they're so bad, and designing some new support to help make them playable. The process we'll be using is examining what it is they do, diagnosing what their problems are, and prescribing a treatment for them to be less awful. With all that said, let's get to the video. Listen, I recognize I might be a little biased in reviewing Mayakashis, even more so than entities, surprisingly enough. But to be honest, I'm kinda running out of ideas here. Most of my IRL friends have exhausted all of their favorite legacy archetypes to review, and my Patreon count is starting to slip into negative integers at this point. However, it is October, so a zombie deck is called for and very fitting for the occasion, and having my ass royally kicked on a weekly basis by vampires, I don't think they qualify as needing additional support. Plus, it was my birthday a little over a week ago, so I'm gonna go ahead and consider this a belated present to myself. However, setting aside as much personal bias as I possibly can, Mayakashis still aren't anything special. They have some sort of connection with the Shiranui archetype, and while the lore relationship between the two is a bit ambiguous, in terms of gameplay, neither offers much to the other's playstyle other than Mayakashi's offering Shiranui's a simple banishing trigger that also locks you out of making Shiranui plays. They have the ability to shit out the entirety of their own extra deck with just a handful of cards, but with the archetype locking being as hard as it is, they just can't build any sort of board that can stand even a fart's chance in the wind in today's metagame. Why that is will soon become obvious once we start the examination. Due to their design philosophy and general playstyle, we'll be flip-flopping all over this archetype in favor of my usual pattern, but I promise that there is a reason for all this. We start off with Shafu, the wheeled Mayakashi. Who dat man in there? He's a level 3 Earth zombie with 1200 attack and 400 defense, and the following effect. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can target one Mayakashi monster in your graveyard, except Shafu, the wheeled Mayakashi, special summon it in defense position, but it negate its effects. You can only use this effect of Shafu, the wheeled Mayakashi, once per turn. You cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except Mayakashi monsters. Shafu is more of a band-aid for the archetype than anything else, which is sad because he was so close to being the true star of the Mayakashi main deck. You see, Mayakashi monsters primarily get their effects off by being revived from the graveyard, so they need to have as much revival options as possible. That being said, this plucky son of a bitch ruined any chance he had of being a major contributor to this playstyle by negating the effects of whatever he revives. This means that the only way you'll be able to get any use out of him is reviving a very specific monster to be able to go into another extra deck vomit session after your board is already broken. At which point you won't be able to do so without playing into a negate or two, rendering him useless. Also, one more thing I have to mention is that the extra deck lock is not, as you would expect, a restriction placed on using the effect, but rather a separate and continuous effect that is active at all times and can be found on every single non-tuner Pringle in the archetype. While that is a fair restriction on a deck with this much speed, it also proves to be the ultimate nail in the coffin for them, as the Mayakashi extra deck leaves a lot to be desired in the end board. I suppose it does allow for some spicy Shien spy techs, but beyond that admittedly cathartic gimmick, it's an extreme hindrance that prevents you from building a board that doesn't die to a stiff breeze. The reason for that will become obvious with the next card, but before that, one last thing I have to mention is that this smiley bastard isn't even this monster's true form. See, the Mayakashi are thematically based on Japanese yokai disguising as humans, and in this guy's case, his true form looks like this. Beautiful. Oboro Garama, the wheeled Mayakashi, is also a level 3 Earth, only this time it's a synchro monster with 800 attack and 2100 defense. is completely generic, but you can only control one Oborogorama, the Wheeled Mayakashi. You can only use each of these effects of Oborogorama, the Wheeled Mayakashi, once per turn. If a synchro monster in your possession, whose original level is 5, is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect while this card is in your graveyard, you can banish one other zombie monster from your graveyard, and if you do, special summon this card. And if this card is special summoned from the graveyard, you can activate this effect. This turn, your monsters cannot be destroyed by battle. The restriction of only being able to control one of them, along with the first effect and a half, are shared among all the synchro monsters in this archetype. Said restriction only becomes a problem once in a blue moon, so it's not something that needs to be worried about in all times. What should be worried about is the self-summon effect. While being instantly able to replace an important boss monster with another 1-2 levels lower that triggers said smaller monster's revival effect sounds great in theory. In practice, however, it's severely underwhelming. Your opponent would have to be clinically brain dead to continue to let you gain advantage off of destroying your monsters, so they're bound to take care of them one way or another. And unless your opponent specifically destroys the monster in question, you can't revive the next in line, meaning that a single piece of non-destruction removal completely ruins the entire deck. And in a format where such removal is commonplace in one form or another, you can be sure that it's going to happen eventually. And that's not even counting the very common techs of Called by the Grave or DD Crow being able to permanently break the chain at any time. And on top of all that, we still haven't even gotten to this card in particular. While its stats are moderately impressive for a level 3, the revival effect is easily the worst one in the archetype. As the last monster in the chain, you would expect it to have the best effect in order to prevent losing said chain, but battle protection is hardly relevant these days, even if it does cover your entire field. Granted, I have been in situations where it saved my ass once or twice, and it's the first monster you need to make when climbing the synchro ladder, so you'll still need to make it regardless of preference, but boy howdy is it still an underwhelming mess. Don't run more than one. Phew, that was a rather long-winded explanation of the archetype as a whole, but with that out of the way, perhaps we can get back to reviewing individual cards. The next card is Tsukahagi, the Poisonous Mayakashi. It's a level 2 Earth Tuner with no attack and 2000 defense, and you can only control one Tsukahagi, the Poisonous Mayakashi. If a Mayakashi monster in your possession, except Tsukahagi, the Poisonous Mayakashi, is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect while this card is in the graveyard, you can special summon this card. You cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck the turn you activate this effect, except Mayakashi monsters. Yes, the tuners also have the same restrictions as the extra deck monsters, but let's ignore that for now. This card seems like a really good one on the surface, but the cracks quickly start to show the more you look at it. First of all, it's another card that relies entirely on your opponent to work, and you guys know how I feel about that. Second, its entire effect mirrors that of the Synchro Monster's effects, but for no apparent reason. I can only assume that the intent is to be able to supply a tuner in order to Synchro Climb again should your board get wiped. But that also requires you to have multiple copies of each monster in your extra deck, of which you can only have 3 each and 15 total if you completely ignore outside support, which you absolutely should not. And finally, as a recovery option, there are far better options in the archetype than a 2k wall that doesn't do anything other than act as an extra body during the opponent's turn of all things. Just don't bother with this one. His evolved form, however, you can bother with, but even then I wouldn't go crazy with it. Tsuchigumo, the Poisonous Mayakashi, also known as the Arachnophobe's worst nightmare, is a level 5 Earth with 2000 attack and 1800 defense, and his revival effect mills 3 cards from the top of each player's deck. I mentioned in the last episode how helping your opponent can be worth it if the cost-benefit plays in your favor, and this one just barely skirts that line. The benefit of having a mill effect in a zombie deck can never be understated, even if it does help the opponent out as well. However, the degree to which it helps the opponent varies heavily on the matchup, and if it tips the balance too far in the opponent's favor, there's really nothing more you can do besides scooping. Even still, you run at least one out of necessity, use it where you can, and curse Halakti in the event of an unfavorable matchup. The next card is the first really good one in the archetype, that being Hyjin, the winged Mayakashi, looking suspiciously like Shiranui Solitaire. You know, you tend to overlook how terrifying the implications of a monster switching archetypes must be. What could have happened to this poor man that turned him into some otherworldly monster than this? What are you hiding there, my man? Who hurt you? Anyway, he's a level 1 wind with 600 attack and 400 effect, and his effect is the exact same as Shafu's, except that he summons from the deck and doesn't negate the effects or specify the battle position of what he summons. This is your primary starter for the archetype, since he can immediately summon another Mayakashi from your deck in order to go into extra deck plays. Namely, the card you're going to be summoning most often off of his effect is the other tuner monster in the archetype, which we'll get into shortly. But even if you do draw into a second one of these after exploding the extra deck, there's still yet another target worth going into with this, so you're not left completely high out of the water. If you plan on doing anything with this deck, you can never have less than 3 of these. His monster form is Tengu, the winged Mayakashi. It's a level 7 wind with 2600 attack and 1500 defense, and his revival effect pops a spell trap on the opponent's field. From this moment on, you're going to want to run at least 2 copies of each synchro, since you're going to be actively reviving Tsuchigumo to continue your plays more often than not. But as for this guy, he's actually fairly decent. You may have noticed that his pop effect doesn't target, which you would think doesn't change much since targeting protection on spell traps is surprisingly rare. But it also means that your opponent has to either let it happen or activate all their set spell traps at once to avoid losing them, since you only choose what to pop upon resolution. That is, of course, assuming that they can't simply negate it, which is a bold assumption to make in this meta. But considering you probably went through 2 other synchros with much more powerful effects to get here, there's a chance that they already blew through all of their negates at this point. It's also assuming that you were even able to get this far, and a single back row pop isn't likely to do much, but it can still come in handy once in a while. The next monster is Daki, the graceful Mayakashi, also known as Shiranui Squire's BFF. She's a level 2 fire tuner with 1000 attack and no defense, and you can only control one Daki, the graceful Mayakashi. When a Mayakashi monster is a special summon to your field from the extra deck while this card is in the graveyard, except during the damage step, you can special summon this card. You cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck the turn you activate this effect, except Mayakashi monsters. This is the engine that makes Mayakashis go off the way they're supposed to. You may have noticed that she has no once per turn clause, hard or otherwise, meaning that if she's used to make a Mayakashi synchro monster, she can continue to revive herself and be used with the new synchro monster to make another one, climbing the ladder all the way to the top as many times as possible. As such, you really can't do without her in the deck. She does, however, lock the user into the archetype extremely hard, almost as hard as Deep Entity Hydra in that regard. But as the sole reason why the deck is able to even function, you'll have to bite down on that bullet if you want to play this deck. The ratios can be tricky, however, as you really don't want to draw into her, and you also don't want to risk losing your one copy as she is prime called by the grave bait. My personal recommendation would have to be either 1 or 2 copies. Her true form is Yoko, the graceful Mayakashi, also known as Shiranui Skill Saga's FFB. It's a level 9 fire with 2900 attack and 2400 defense, and her revival effect pops a monster on the opponent's field. Similar to the last synchro monster, this one can actually dodge targeting protection with its pop effect, which is bound to come in handy quite a bit. It's also slightly more likely to run into a negate though, assuming she was even able to hit the field to begin with, but even then it's not enough of a reason to not use this one. Run 2. The next monster is Yasha, the skeletal Mayakashi. If that is skeletal, then I must be male model material. Anyway, he's a level 5 Dark with 2000 attack and no defense, and his effect lets you discard another Mayakashi monster to special summon it from the hand. It's just a worse Cyber Dragon in a deck that really didn't need one. In case you hadn't noticed, you want to be able to start as low on the Synchro ladder as possible, so those extra 4 stars are a huge pain in the ass to deal with. He's got okay stats for a level 5, so he can be useful as a mediocre beater, but the deck already has that in the form of their Synchro, so they don't need an inconsistent main deck beater that eats up resources just to hit the field. Just don't bother. His upgraded form, however, is worth running for beat stick potential. Gasha Dokuro, the skeletal Mayakashi, is a level 11 Dark with a whopping 3300 attack and 2600 defense, and his revival effect turns him into a towers for the rest of the turn. As a fully generic level 11 monster, its stats are really good, being 100 bigger than even a hot RDA Abyss and 300 bigger than most tower clones. There is the concern that the immunity is only temporary and is susceptible to negation, but as far as raw power goes, it doesn't get much better than this. However, sharp-eyed skeptics may notice that there is no such thing as a level 13 Synchro, but fortunately Konami thought of that, as Gasha actually has a slightly different summoning condition to the others, as he requires a Link monster to be destroyed instead. There is actually a Link monster in the Archetype, but before we get into that, we have to cover their last main deck monster first. Yuki Musume. Seriously? You couldn't have come up with anything more clever than that? Like maybe Yukina or Yuna or Yamato if you wanted to get really creative? Well, anyway, Lil Yuki, the Ice Mayakashi, is a level 1 water with no attack and 1900 defense, and the following effect. If you control a Mayakashi card other than Yuki Musume, the Ice Mayakashi, while this card is in your hand or graveyard, you can special summon this card, then send one zombie monster from your deck to the graveyard. You can only use this effect of Yuki Musume, the Ice Mayakashi, once per turn. Blah blah, you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except Mayakashi monsters. Little Yuki does pretty much everything for you. She summons herself for you to use as an extra body, sets up your graveyard for making further plays, gives you a foot massage, stuff like that. An easy self-summoning condition that works from the hand or the graveyard, meaning that this little bitch has self-recycling of all things, all for the quote-unquote cost of simply controlling another Mayakashi monster. As if that wasn't enough, in addition to that, she also serves as a free foolish burial of any zombie-type monster simultaneous with the special summon condition. This means that she can set up not only Daki for her excellent Synchro Climb ability, but also the likes of Mizuki, Glow Up Bloom, Necro World Banshee, and any number of the metric fuckton of generic zombie support that gets off by being in the graveyard. Run 3 of these things at all times, don't ever leave the house without her. So in case you were wondering about Lil Yuki's lazy naming convention, the reason is that she's the only Mayakashi Pringle to come out after her upgraded form did. Yuki Onna, the Ice Mayakashi, is a Link 2 water with 1900 attack and arrows bottom left and bottom right. Requires 2 Mayakashi monsters as material, and since it's the cap on the chain, it functions slightly different from the others. You can only control one Yuki Onna, the Ice Mayakashi. While this card points to a Synchro monsters, your opponent cannot target this card for attacks. If a Synchro monster is in your possession is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect while this card is on the field, you can target one face-up monster on the field. Its attack and defense become half its current attack and defense until the end of the turn. You can only use this effect of Yuki Onna, the Ice Mayakashi once per turn. Okay, it's not wildly different, but it's still worth mentioning, at least. Since this is, again, essentially the cap on the chain, there is some protection afforded to itself that forces the opponent to deal with the Synchros first. And while battle protection isn't anything to put your entire hopes on, it still comes into play more often than not. Furthermore, in addition to the floating of the Synchros in grave, Yuki Onna also has a revenge effect that slashes the stats of an opponent's monster in half. While it does target, which loses a lot of its inherent versatility, it does take current stats into account, so it can potentially save yourself from an Equimax OTK or something of the sort. However, even with all that said, she herself isn't anything special since she's still easily taken care of and doesn't have the power to do anything on her own. She's still pretty good, but I've definitely seen better Yukiona is all I'm saying. If I were to give this a grade, I'd give this thing a B-, but with a big red could do better see me after class mark right next to it. Their first spell card is Mayakashi Return. Take one Mayakashi card from your deck, except itself, and either add it to your hand or send it to the graveyard. You can only activate one Mayakashi Return per turn. Always run 3 and never any less. The fact that it can act as an archetypal Rhoda or Foolish, depending on your preference at the moment, is a level of consistency that most decks can only dream of. The hard ones per turn can be a bit of a problem if you draw into more than one of them, which tends to happen more often than I care to admit. But even then, that's still not enough of a reason to not max out on it. Their next spell card is Mayakashi Winter. It's a continuous spell with this effect. Monsters your opponent controls lose 100 attack and defense for each Mayakashi monster in your graveyard with a different name. You can send this card and one face-up Mayakashi monster you control to the graveyard, draw one card. You can banish this card and one zombie monster from your graveyard, then target one Mayakashi monster in your graveyard, special summon it. You can only use one Mayakashi Winter effect per turn and only once that turn. I like how the debuff effect stacks with other copies of itself, because I can't see why else you'd run it for this effect since it'll never get above 1200 with its maximum graveyard setup. 900 if you only consider the members worth running. No, you'll want to run it for the other two effects here. At the end of the synchro chain, you're often left with a Daky on board that isn't doing anything, so you can use this card to send it away to get a draw off of it. Then on the next turn, you can use this card's graveyard effect to revive one of the synchros for their effects and continue making plays. Alternatively, you can also dump this off of return to go straight into the graveyard effect if you need to keep building a board to begin with. Run 2 or 3 of these. You know, perhaps I should give Konami a lot more credit, as once again they're one step ahead of me, since the next card is yet another last-minute addition that did not exist by the time I first finished this script. Ghost Meets Girl, a Mayakashi story, is a quick play spell card with the following effect. During the main phase, target one zombie synchro monster you control, special summon one of your zombie monsters with the same attribute that is banished or in your graveyard, but banish the summoned monster during the end phase. Also, for the rest of this turn after this card resolves, you cannot special summon monsters except zombie monsters. You can only activate one Ghost Meets Girl, a Mayakashi story per turn. Honestly, I have to wonder why they even bothered to make this a quick play. The idea of being able to trigger the Synchro's revival effects at will on your opponent's turn sounds great in theory, but this one just doesn't work that way. The requirements of using another Mayakashi Synchro to do the special summon effectively prevents this play, as the only 2 Synchros that have the same attribute are Oborogorama and Tsuchigumo, 2 of the worst Synchro monsters in the Archetype. So the utility of doing this is severely limited. No, the most practical play with this card comes down to its comeback potential. If you happen to lose an important piece of your combo, like say Daky for instance, all you need to do is have their evolved form on the field, or a similar monster, in order to get it back in order to make more plays with it. At which point there is no reason whatsoever in activating this on the opponent's turn, since there is no way of making use of the summoned monster before it gets banished again anyway. Still, this is a fairly decent card, but before I move on here, I just want to analyze this artwork a bit more, since it raises a lot more questions than it answers in terms of lore. Obviously, this seems to take place after Fateful Hour, but now we have Yuki, of all things, stepping in to throw her hat into the ring, which is odd since she should be on Yoko's side here. It does seem like she's just trying to keep Yoko and Skill Saga from fighting, but that just brings attention to the fact that we still don't know what happened between them to make them fight in the first place. I am so confused about this backstory, and it seems like Konami is actively taunting me by giving us crap like this instead of any actual answers, especially since they seem so skittish about making support for this archetype that would actually benefit them on a fundamental level. Am I going crazy here? Wait, actually, don't answer that. Anyway, run 1 or 2 stories once it comes out. The last card is Mayakashi Metamorphosis. It's a trap card with this effect. Discard 1 card, then target one of your Mayakashi monsters that is banished or in your graveyard, special summon it. Your opponent cannot target it with card effects this turn. You cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck the turn you activate this card except Mayakashi monsters. You can only activate 1 Mayakashi Metamorphosis per turn. I don't think I'm going to even activate 1 per turn because I'm not going to run it. There are so many ways this thing could have been better, but it's like Konami didn't want to commit to any of them. If this were a quick play spell, it would be much better at being able to build a starting board without having to set this card and wait a turn to use it. I say quick play because I can see the benefit in being able to summon Tengu or Yoko during the opponent's turn, see the last card. But having it be a trap card makes it into a bricky win more card at best. If it didn't have the discard effect, it would be fine as an even 0 revival effect that no one would complain about due to it being a trap card. But because it does, it becomes way too much of a cost for the deck to be able to handle consistently for not a lot of comeback potential. Considering how easy it is to just obliterate the Mayakashi's end board, they needed some way to be able to come back from a beatdown, but this card is not the way to go with it. I like how the summoned monster has targeting immunity for the turn, but in a format with Nibiru breaking boards left and right, targeting immunity isn't nearly enough anymore. I suppose it's not the worst tech in the world, and it is searchable by return, so I guess run 1 if it's going to make you feel special. This is a variation on my personal Mayakashi deck with a standard zombie world engine installed since they really need all the help they can get in terms of protection and consistency. Feel free to splash in any other generic zombie engine you feel like. So now comes the diagnosis, and as someone who actually mains this deck, I feel like I can speak with some form of authority with this one. First and foremost, they need a stronger end board to be able to work toward. I understand that this level of extra deck vomiting needs to be severely limited into their own archetype, but that's just all the more reason to make monsters worth going into with this archetype. In a format where nobody wants to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's considered bricking if you end with less than 3 negates, they simply can't compete when they can't put up any aside from Ballardrock if they're lucky. They also need some sort of insurance policy to either make sure they play the way they're supposed to, or a way to recover should things turn sour. As strong as they seem on the surface, they're actually surprisingly fragile since any form of non-destruction removal ruins the entire deck. Some alternate options in building said board would be nice as well. Since the deck relies very heavily on very specific starters to get going, this is one of the few modern decks that can be completely halted by a goddamn prohibition. Lastly, and somewhat counterintuitively, they need a bit of protection to keep their board together. While the synchros do want to get destroyed, even in the best of circumstances, your opponent can simply out-resource you and muscle through the entire chain if they absolutely have to, assuming they can't simply out it through the reasons stated above. And now we come to the prescription. Mind you, I do need to be careful not to make them too broken given the existence of Daki and the ability to shit out every extra deck monster at once. But as long as I stick with the formula, I should be okay here. Also, it should go without saying that I took on most of these myself. Kieran did put up an effort, but as someone who is personally invested with this archetype, I wanted to take on the bulk of it myself. We start off with Okura, the playful Mayakashi. A level 1 light with no attack and 1000 defense, and the following effect. If this card is in the graveyard, you can send 1 Mayakashi monster you control to the graveyard. Special summon 1 Mayakashi monster from your graveyard except Okura the Playful Mayakashi. You can only use this effect of Okura the Playful Mayakashi once per turn. You cannot special summon monster from the extra deck except Mayakashi monsters. I don't think I need to explain why an archetypal Mizuki in a zombie archetype is a good card, especially when said archetype gets their effects off when they get revived from the graveyard. It's actually a bit better than Mizuki since it doesn't remove itself from the graveyard to do so, allowing you to use its effect again on your next turn without needing to set it up again. It does require you to have a Mayakashi on the field, so while it can allow you to swap out a synchro for another, it still requires a bit of setup to work. It also gets taken care of easily by Called by the Grave, but that also applies to 90% of the deck already. Run 2 or 3 of these depending on your preference. However, it wouldn't be a Mayakashi without a yokai form, so here's hers. Zashiki Warashi, the playful Mayakashi, try saying that 5 times fast, is a Link 1 light with 500 attack and an arrow to the right. God, I'm just rhyming everything today, aren't I? Requires a level 5 or lower Mayakashi as material, and you can only control one Zashiki Warashi. While this card points to a synchro monster, your opponent cannot target this card for attacks or card effects. You can discard one zombie monster, special summon one Mayakashi monster from your graveyard to a zone this card points to. You can only use this effect of Zashiki Warashi, the playful Mayakashi, once per turn. This is going to be your primary extender in that she can help build a board that can actually stand up the way it's supposed to. The right arrow requires a bit of extra setup in order to get her into a main monster zone, but if the deck is functioning the way it should be, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's also a Link 1, which works really well with Daky, though it's also the only Link 1 for very much this reason, as well as having the only controlling 1 clause to prevent her from being over-abusable. Again, run 2 or 3 of these. The next monster is Maneki, the feline Mayakashi. He's a chunky boy. He's a level 3 Earth with 200 attack and 1500 defense, and the following effect. You can discard one Mayakashi monster, special summon as many Maneki Neko tokens, level 2 zombie Earth tuners with no attack or defense as possible, but you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except Mayakashi monsters as long as you control a Maneki Neko token. You can only use this effect of Maneki, the feline Mayakashi, once per turn, and you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except Mayakashi monsters. This basically serves as an emergency replacement for Daky, being able to synchro climb up to 11 without using her effect, assuming you have an empty board when you summon him. Doing this skips over Oborogorama, unfortunately, but it can also do in a pinch for setting up a board without perma-locking you into the archetype if need be. 1 or 2 should be fine. Its monster form is Nekomata, the feline Mayakashi, a Link 3 Earth with 2200 attack and arrows to the top right, and bottom left. Requires 2 or more zombie monsters as material, and you can only control one Nekomata. Link monsters this card points to cannot be targeted by your opponent's card effects. You can send one Mayakashi monster from your hand or field to the graveyard, except Nekomata, the feline Mayakashi. Draw 1 card. You can only use this effect of Nekomata, the feline Mayakashi, once per turn. Notice how this one extends the protection to your other monsters instead of hogging it all for itself. This allows you to maintain your board while directing your opponents to destroying the things you want them to. The trigger effect is just there as a means of either taking advantage of the extra Daky or setting up the effects of Okura, Little Yuki, or even the next monster we'll get into later. Again, run 1 or 2. The last Pringle in the archetype is Kawako, the aquatic Mayakashi. She's a level 4 water tuner with 1800 attack and no defense. And you can only control one Kawako, the aquatic Mayakashi. You can normal summon one Mayakashi monster in addition to your normal summoner set. You can only gain this effect once per turn. Normal or special summons of your Mayakashi monsters cannot be negated. If this card is banished, you can target one of your banished Mayakashi monsters, return it to the graveyard. You cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck the turn you activate this effect, except Mayakashi monsters. As far as the tuners go, I would place this one closer to Daky in terms of usefulness. Not only does she provide an extra normal summon in an attempt to build a strong first turn board, but she also prevents the summons of Mayakashis from being negated, so you have a little insurance in building said board. In addition to that, she also has an effect when she's banished that recycles any banished Mayakashi monster, including herself, that is also not limited by a once per turn clause, meaning that she can continuously recycle herself to be used for the cost of the Synchro Monster's revival effects. Now, there are reasons not to do this in the upcoming support, but the ability to continuously fuel these effects as needed is still a viable option. Make sure to run 3 of these. And the last monster is Kappa, the aquatic Mayakashi. It's a Link 4 water with 2800 attack, arrows pointing top right, left, right, and down. Requires 2 or more monsters, including a Mayakashi monster, and you can only control 1 Kappa. Link monsters card points to cannot be targeted for attacks. When your opponent activates a card or effect, quick effect, you can send 1 Mayakashi monster you control to the graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, banish that card. You can only use this effect of Kappa the Aquatic Mayakashi once per turn. This serves as the main source of negation in the archetype, serving as a more permanent boss monster in the archetype. The protection it offers is a bit underwhelming, following the trend of getting worse protection the higher the link rating, but it's serviceable enough to be able to come in handy once in a while. Still, considering the lack of options, the negation effect is reason alone enough to run 1 or 2 copies. Their new field spell is Mayakashi Yokai Shrine. If a Mayakashi monster leaves the field due to an opponent's card effect, or if your opponent tributes or uses a Mayakashi monster you control as material, treat those monsters as being destroyed. You can only use each of the following effects of Mayakashi Yokai Shrine once per turn. When this card is activated, you can add 1 Mayakashi spell or trap card from your deck to your hand, except Mayakashi Yokai Shrine. And you can return 1 of your banished zombie monsters to the graveyard, send 1 Mayakashi monster from your deck to the graveyard. The consistency boosting of searching a spell or trap on activation can be of help in setting up your plays. The graveyard setup is really good at letting you use the effects of Lil Yuki, Dakai, Okura, and Kawako when you need it, provided you already have the necessary setup. But the real meat of the effect is the insurance policy. If your opponent causes a Mayakashi monster to leave the field for any reason, it treats it as being destroyed, meaning that you're guaranteed to be able to get the effects of the synchros in the graveyard off no matter what. This is important since any form of non-destruction removal would otherwise spell doom for the entire deck. So if you run any less than 3 of these, you're not playing Mayakashis. The next card is Mayakashi Possession, picturing Shiranui's squire getting totally fucked by a wind ghost. It's a continuous spell with this effect. Mayakashi monsters you control gain 100 attack and defense for each Mayakashi monster in your graveyard with a different name. You can target 1 of your banished zombie monsters, shuffle it into the deck, or if the targeted monster is a Mayakashi monster, you can add it to your hand instead. If a Mayakashi Synchro monster is special summoned to your field, quick effect, you can make that monster be unable to be targeted by your opponent's card effects until the end phase. You can only activate 1 effect of Mayakashi Possession per turn and only once per turn. This is a nice companion piece to Mayakashi Winter since they both have good beatdown effects and deal with the banishing and recycling of monsters. It also gives a bit of protection to your Synchro monsters during the turn they're summoned, making them even better for beatdown strategies. I wouldn't necessarily max out on it, but 1 or 2 should be fine. Next up is Mayakashi Final Gesture, featuring a lore so profound that I had to go out of my way to try and recreate it with my shitty Photoshop skills. It's a quick play with this effect. Shuffle any number of your banished zombie monsters into the deck. Special summon 1 Mayakashi monster from your graveyard to either side of the field, whose attack is less than or equal to the number of monsters shuffled into the deck times 500. You can only activate 1 Mayakashi Final Gesture per turn. Again, this is not an archetype that can really get enough of Graveyard Revival, but this one is a bit interesting in that regard. You could revive 1 of the Synchro monsters to build a strong board or beat down the opponent for game, but you would need to banish at least 7 monsters for Gasha or 6 for Yoko and Tengu in order to do this. However, you may have noticed they can summon a Mayakashi to the opponent's side of the field, which actually does benefit you considering the non-tuner Pringles constantly lock them out of the extra deck as long as they control it. This can turn your spent playmakers into archetypal Nightmare Iblis that could force your opponent to crash it into 1 of your monsters in order to make their plays. Furthermore, if we exclude Yasha, the strongest of these is Hyjin with a whopping 600 attack, so you won't need more than 1 or 2 zombies in the banished pile to use this. Run 3 of these. The last card is Mayakashi Burial. It's a counter trap with this effect. When your opponent activates a card or effect while you control a Mayakashi Synchro monster, you can banish one Mayakashi monster from your graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. In quick effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard, special summon one Mayakashi monster from your graveyard. You can only activate one effect of Mayakashi Burial per turn and only once per turn. Sure, this is just your standard copy and paste archetypal counter trap, but I would argue that this is an archetype that needs it, since they can't put up much in the way of negates other than Kappa. It also has a graveyard effect where it can banish itself to special summon a Mayakashi from the graveyard, as if the archetype hasn't got enough of that already. Still though, as boring as it is, it still helps out the deck immensely, so make sure to run 2. And that's all I got. Frankly, I'm glad this archetype has some more options going forward, considering that this is the hardest archetype lock to work around since ninjas. I'm going to keep my closing thoughts short here, since this archetype really doesn't have any images to show, so I'm just going to put up some random shit while I collect myself. I like this archetype for several reasons, no matter how subjectively bad it is. Even if it doesn't get any new support going forward, I will still continue to play it out of principle if for no other reason. So at the very least, I can take this episode as a personal fantasy if nothing else, and be happy enough with that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Things have been pretty hectic over here, so I really appreciate you taking the time to watch these. I'm sorry I missed last week's upload, but both my plan, my backup plan, and my backup plan all simultaneously failed on me, so I had to go without that time. I do have something special planned for the next episode, so keep an eye out for that one. But anyway, thanks for watching, happy Halloween, and until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.